Europe is committing suicide, or at least its leaders have decided to commit suicide. Whether European people choose to go along with this is naturally another matter. What are you driving at? This is fairly inflammatory. And there's Islam on the front cover of the book.
Well, it's first of all, it's very good to be with you, Nick.
Good to see you.
In person. I've been travelling a lot in recent years across our continent, from the reception islands in the south of Europe, in Italy and Greece, where migrants are coming in, still coming in, roughly 6,000 in an average 24 hours to one island. And I've been following that story up. A lot of people don't bother following the story up, but following it to suburbs of German and French cities and bits of Scandinavia, and seeing what actually happens. And I think it's a catastrophe, and I think it is vastly understated by our entire political class. And in this country, you know, we have a sort of strange debate about this. People say, you know, we don't talk about immigration enough. That's not quite true. What we don't do is talk seriously enough about it. We occasionally in this country have a big flare-up about, for instance, the Calais camp, understandably. And every time that happens, various people say, why don't we let in the people in Calais? Ordinarily, there's about 6,000 people in Calais. 6,000 people, as I say, come in roughly every 24 hours to one island. And so we fantastically underestimate the scale of this challenge. People on the right sometimes think it's incredibly easy to stop. You know, you could simply stop the boats coming or something like that. And that's a mistake. People don't realize the huge complexity of that. And people, broadly speaking, on the left have this fantastical mistake of thinking, oh, once they're in, they'll become Europeans. And
what's the truth?
The truth is that that's very unlikely. It's very unlikely that when you import people into a continent from so many different places around the world, that you aren't, first of all, just going to import the world's problems as well as the world's people. And secondly, that they will become sort of liberal-minded Europeans. I give a lot of evidence in the book from polling, observation, statistics, to show that there might be a quite different future in this, that instead of, as it were, Europeanizing the world, that Europe becomes more like the third world.
Can I put you, do you have a problem then with tolerance?
I think that we as a society have a problem with this.
But what's the alternative then?
Well,
we're not going to be tolerant.
No,
we're going to be intolerant.
I think that tolerance has borders, like everything else should. That there are people who are intolerant who you should not tolerate. Let me give you a very quick example, if I may. I'm gay.
Right.
And it's not a very big thing in my politics or in my views. But I was very struck a year or so ago, and YouGov did a poll of attitudes towards homosexuality across the country. You would think this would sort of smoke out some homophobes in Yorkshire and, you know, the Dales and Wales. And say, no, no, no. Most of the country, about 14% of people said they had a problem with homosexuality. In London, that was double.
I think I know where we're going.
Why would that be?
Yeah, go on.
Might it be that when, as I say, you import people from across the world, they don't all have the sort of Dutch and British views of, for instance, sexual difference, or gender difference, or even religious difference? What are the religious murders we've had in Britain in recent years? The most striking thing is Muslim on Muslim murders. An Ahmadiyya shopkeeper in Glasgow murdered because of his faith by another Muslim.
Who drove halfway up the country to do it.
Who drove halfway up the country to do it. So I'm not saying it's all bad by any means. What I'm saying is that I think we should be looking at this much more seriously and considering that, this is the overriding thing, considering that it may not work. We are trying to do something historically fantastic.
But what's the alternative, then?
The alternative...
Literally, razor wire fences.
No, the first thing is the thing that publics across Europe are all begging their governments to do. Just slow it down.
How can you? If there's 6,000 people coming across the Med every day, what are you going to do, watch them drown? I know you don't literally wouldn't let them drown.
I have a chapter in the book explaining the things that we should have done from the beginning of the recent part of the crisis, which is quite straightforward. You stop people getting into Europe to begin with, because once people are in Europe, they stay. They always stay. I mean, it's a myth that anyone really gets returned. Tiny numbers of people get returned. So once you go in, exactly, and once you, as it were, break into Europe, you're rewarded for having done so. You become a European. You're part of Europe. So I think one of the first things is you've got to stop that flow. And I have a whole chapter on the things you could do. Leasing land from North African countries, making sure that the processing...
Yes, you talk about stopping it at source. I read that bit, which is what Mr Cameron, of course, talked about when he was Prime Minister.
Yes, talked about being an important part of that.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that we have a misunderstanding about this whole crisis, if I can say so. whenever you speak to somebody who says, for instance, why don't we let them in, they are under the misapprehension that most of these people are, for instance, fleeing the Syrian civil war. Now, the Syrian civil war is a terrible war. It's beyond our control to stop it. And it is undoubtedly a humanitarian crisis. But most of the people coming into Europe are not coming from Syria. They are, as I've observed myself, coming from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Far East, from across the Middle East. When people say, well, if we solve the Syrian civil war, what's your plan for Eritrea or Nigeria or Chad or any of the other places that people are coming from? Nobody can answer that. And so the key thing is that we're not doing the world a favour by implying that they can come in.
But there is a school of thought that one of the ways to defeat ISIS, and there is an argument that ISIS in any way is being pushed back, is that they had this culture of hatred, that Europe hates you. And the fact that actually Europe doesn't hate you, Europe is quite welcoming, particularly if you look at Angela Merkel and her policy, that was a way to defeat the ISIS ideology. I've read that. Now, you might totally disagree with it, but I put that to you at least as another way of seeing what Merkel was trying to achieve.
If that was what she was trying to achieve, then she'd have to take the bad with good, wouldn't she? And accept then on her conscience the people mown down by a truck in Berlin before the Christmas market, before Christmas. She'd have to take onto her own conscience the first suicide bombing in Germany in 2016, outside a wine bar in Ansbach. She'd have to take on her own conscience the ISIS axeman on a train who ended up brutally hacking at a family actually of Chinese tourists in Bavaria. She'd have to take all these things on board, and then she should turn around to the German people and say, I'm playing a very long game, and you're just going to have to put up with a lot of suicide terrorism and a lot of bad things in the meantime, but it'll turn out all right in the end. And as I say, again, maybe she's right, but if she's wrong, and I think she's wrong, then she is screwing up an entire continent.
So you talk immigration identity in Islam. I mean, the Islam part is not necessarily fair then for those who are all coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Isn't that right? It's just an inflammatory word to put on the cover of your book, Douglas, because you know it's going to attract attention.
No, not at all. I put it there because I think it's the hardest bit of this issue. Europe and our country, I mean Europe as a whole, as a culture, has boundaries and has borders and has a past. Now, one of the things about that is we are able to integrate people. My view is we can integrate people into that culture as long as it happens slowly and as long as the change is not too radical. Now, I think that one of the hardest bits of this is not actually it's not easy for a Nigerian Christian to move to the UK. It is, I would argue, harder for somebody of an Islamic background to integrate into Britain. And this, I think this is perfectly obvious. It's so blindingly obvious that people never say it. But the bigger the difference of leap of culture, the more problems it seems to me you're likely to have. And the larger the numbers, the more long-term that problem is. So this isn't about beating up on Islam or Muslims or anything like it, but it's saying we are going to have a serious problem of digesting this kind of flow.
So has multiculturalism been a total failure? Should we not even try to explore it?
Well, everybody says it's a failure. In one chapter of my book, I explain in 2010, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, said it was a failure. Nicolas Sarkozy said it was a failure. David Cameron said it was a failure. And then 5 years
what
later...
do we do then?
Well, 5 years later, they opened the borders of Europe for it. So if it was working so badly
I'm
in
a Sikh,
2010...
can I come to Britain, or
Right.
I'm a Muslim? Am I allowed to practice my faith?
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
The first thing,
okay.
I come back to the
So it's
first thing.
monoculturalism?
I come back to the first thing. The first thing is to slow it down. It has to be slowed down. There is no way that countries like Germany can take in 1 to 2% of their population in addition every year and remain stable democratic societies. They are starting to realise that. But why, instead of making these mistakes, don't they consider them before they make them?
We've almost come to the end of our time, and you did graciously say you're going to take calls. We must get at least one call in. Zainol is in Crawley. Zainol, you're through to the author of this book, Douglas Murray. Go ahead, Zainol.
Hello, Mr. Murray. My question is, you haven't addressed the question of our interventions in those countries. We attack Libya. French are attacking in West Africa. We completely ignore the fact that the reason why many of these people are leaving is because their countries are destabilized by our foreign policy.
I'm so glad you asked that question, and it's a very important one. Our foreign policy undoubtedly can have a very bad effect on this, but it is not in fact the cause. And let me just explain what I mean by that. In migrant camps last summer, for instance, I was speaking to people who had fled Bangladesh, a lot of people who fled Bangladesh and Burma. I could name you any number of other countries that this country, and indeed our allies, have no involvement in. I mean, we have no involvement in Eritrea, and there are a lot of Eritreans coming into Europe. Bangladesh, we have, perfectly working diplomatic relations with. Pakistan. Huge numbers of the refugees come from Pakistan. This country is close to Pakistan. We have a lot of people of Pakistani origin in this country, and they still come. We are not meddling in Pakistani politics or in Burmese politics or in Bangladeshi politics, and still they come. So I agree that it is a very important question to look at, and we should certainly think, are the things we're doing going to make this worse? But we also have to consider that the Syrian civil war, as I say, which I started with, as I say, which is not the major component of this migration, is something which this country has had no involvement in. And so we have this problem. The world is coming to us, some of it because of our fault, but most of it not. And we, I think, have to be very careful not to simply blame ourselves for the problems of the world.
We're going to go to travel a minute late. If you're stuck on the motorway, I apologise. We're going to take one more call briefly and one more brief answer, if you would, Douglas. James, thank you, Zainal. Sorry, sir, thank you. James in Barnes, your question as briefly as you can to Douglas. Go ahead, James.
Thank you, Douglas. Very, very good to hear you. I would like to just put this metaphor to you, and it includes the last subject on the programme. I would say that Western liberalism has become the gateway drug for the extreme left dealers. And I think, there is the road to hell being paved with good intentions has made an awful lot of very plausible people become extremely gullible.
Quick response, if you've got to keep it fairly tight.
I like the metaphor. I use a similar one. There's a whole chapter in my book on guilt and the way in which we use guilt. And I say that guilt and the tyranny of guilt is something which people in the West are getting high on. And they get carried away with it, and they think if they are guilty of everything and the world is guilty of nothing, then the world will forgive them. And I think all what will happen is they'll discover this is a mono-generational vice.